It started with the sound of a heavy chalk strike against the blackboard. Sharp, cold, almost angry. The classroom was deathly quiet, the only noise coming from the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Jamal sat near the back of the room, his shoulders slightly hunched, his notebook open but untouched. He was 14 years old, tall for his age, with dark brown skin and short, neatly twisted hair. His eyes were sharp, but they held a quiet hesitation, as if he'd learned that speaking up too often led to trouble. He wasn't the loudest kid in the room, nor the smartest, but he was trying, really trying. Jamal, his head jerked up. His teacher, Mrs. Fletcher, stood at the front of the room, her thin lips pressed into a tight line, her blue eyes narrowed beneath sharp-rimmed glasses. She held his test paper between two fingers, like it was contaminated. "You call this effort," she said, her voice slicing through the tense silence. Jamal's stomach twisted. He could feel the eyes of his classmates turning toward him, the quiet snickers from the back of the room. His ears burned as he stared at the paper in her hand. A big red D was circled at the top. Mrs. Fletcher walked toward him, heels clicking against the tiled floor. "You know," she said, holding the paper out just beyond his reach, "if you actually paid attention instead of, well, whatever it is that you people do, you might actually pass for once." Jamal's chest tightened. "You people." He knew exactly what she meant. His fists curled under the desk. A few kids giggled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one said a word. "Maybe academics just aren't your thing," Mrs. Fletcher said with a thin smile. "Maybe you're more suited for other types of work." Jamal's breath caught in his throat, his vision blurred. He could feel his heart hammering against his chest. His mind screamed at him to say something, do something, but his tongue was frozen, locked in place by years of knowing exactly how this type of confrontation would end. And then, a quiet sound, his phone vibrating against his thigh. A text. "Mom, I'm here." Jamal's eyes widened. His mother. He hadn't told her about the test, or the teacher, or how he'd felt like an outsider in that room from the very first day. But somehow, she knew. She always knew. And at that moment, something shifted. Because if there was one person in the world who wouldn't let this stand, it was his mother. The school lobby was cold and sterile, with polished linoleum floors that reflected the harsh white light overhead. The walls were lined with faded posters about academic excellence and school pride, words that seemed hollow in the moment. Jamal sat stiffly on the edge of a plastic chair, his heart still thudding painfully in his chest. Across from him, Mrs. Fletcher stood with her arms crossed, her thin smile curving with a quiet sense of triumph. To her right, the assistant principal, Mr. Davis, stood awkwardly with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He glanced between Mrs. Fletcher and Jamal, with the kind of forced neutrality that masked discomfort. "Your mother will be here soon," Mr. Davis said, his voice clipped and professional. "We'll just wait for her to." The glass door at the front of the office swung open, and there she was. Jamal's mother, Simone, walked in with quiet authority. She wasn't loud, didn't stomp her feet, didn't raise her voice, but her presence filled the room the moment she stepped inside. Her dark skin was radiant under the harsh lighting, her hair pulled back into a sleek bun. She wore a simple gray business suit that hugged her frame, and heels that clicked softly as she approached. Her gaze was sharp and direct, a gaze that had seen struggle, overcome it, and emerged stronger on the other side. "Mrs. Fletcher," Simone's voice was calm but pointed. "I'm Simone Carter, Jamal's mother." Mrs. Fletcher's smile tightened. "Yes, of course. We were just about to discuss Jamal's performance issues." Simone's eyes didn't waver. "Performance issues." Mrs. Fletcher let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Yes, Jamal has been struggling academically for some time now. He seems distracted, unfocused." Jamal's jaw tightened. He stared at the floor, heat crawling up his neck. Distracted. He stayed up late every night working on his assignments, trying to push past the exhaustion, the self-doubt. He knew what Mrs. Fletcher meant. Simone's gaze darkened. "Is that why you singled him out in front of the entire class?" Mrs. Fletcher's expression shifted slightly. "I wouldn't say my son told me what you said." Simone's voice sharpened. "That maybe academics aren't for him. That maybe he's more suited for other types of work." Mrs. Fletcher's lips thinned. That was simply an unfortunate choice of words. Simone stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Was it? Jamal lifted his gaze, his heart thudding. He had never seen his mother like this. Not angry, exactly, but deliberate. Controlled. Her words were measured, like a blade being sharpened. Mrs. Fletcher, Simone said, her voice low and steady. Do you know what Jamal's GPA is? Mrs. Fletcher blinked. Well, it's 3.8. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. And do you know how many hours he spends each night working on your assignments? Simone's tone sharpened. Do you know how many times he's come home feeling defeated because of how you treat him? Mrs. Fletcher's gaze flickered toward Mr. Davis, who shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Davis began. Simone held up a hand. No, I'm not done. Jamal's chest tightened. He could feel the heat rising in the room. His mother's words were slicing through the air with precision. You see, Mrs. Fletcher, Simone continued, I raised my son to believe that hard work and integrity would carry him through life. That respect is something you give and receive. But what exactly are you teaching him? That no matter how hard he works, he'll always be you people. That his intelligence will always be second-guessed because of the color of his skin. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth opened and closed. Her cheeks flushed. I would never imply, but you did. Simone's gaze hardened. And that's why we're here. Jamal sat frozen, his heart hammering. His classmates had never spoken up. The other teachers had turned away. But his mother, she was standing there, calm and unyielding, calling it out for exactly what it was. Now, Simone said, her gaze cutting through the tension. Are we going to address this, or are we going to pretend it didn't happen? The room was silent. Mr. Davis cleared his throat. Mrs. Fletcher's face was pale. Jamal stared at his mother, his chest tightening, with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just relief, it was pride. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth opened and closed, her face reddening. She adjusted her glasses and forced a tight smile. I think we may be overreacting here. Overreacting? Simone's voice sharpened. My son has been humiliated in front of his classmates. Disrespected. Labeled. And you think I'm overreacting? Mrs. Fletcher's gaze darted toward Mr. Davis, but he remained silent. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on them like a weight. Jamal could feel the tension radiating from his mother, the quiet fury that simmered beneath her calm exterior. Simone stepped closer, her eyes locked on Mrs. Fletcher. Let me be very clear, she said, her voice low and steady. You do not get to decide my son's potential. You do not get to define his worth. Mrs. Fletcher's lips thinned. I'm sure we can resolve this without escalating it further. Simone's gaze sharpened. Escalating? Her head tilted slightly. Oh, I'm more than prepared to escalate. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes widened. You see, I happen to know a few members of the school board personally, Simone continued. In fact, I had lunch with the superintendent just last week. Jamal's eyes widened. He had no idea his mother had those kinds of connections. And I'm sure he would be very interested in hearing how one of his teachers is treating minority students, Simone added, her smile thin. Especially when it comes to performance issues. Mrs. Fletcher's face paled. I wasn't implying. You said you people. Simone interrupted. Her tone was like steel, sharp and cutting. And you knew exactly what you meant. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth trembled. I may have misspoken. Or maybe you said exactly what you were thinking. Silence. Jamal's chest tightened. His gaze flicked toward Mr. Davis, whose face had gone completely still. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Simone's expression remained unyielding. You see, Mrs. Fletcher, you made a mistake today. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth twitched. And what mistake would that be? You underestimated my son. Simone turned toward Jamal. Her eyes softened as she crouched down to his level, her hands resting gently on his knees. You are smart, she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. You are capable, and no one gets to make you feel small. Jamal's throat tightened. He blinked hard, his vision blurring. Do you understand me? Simone's eyes glistened. Jamal nodded. Slowly. Simone smiled. Good. She straightened, her gaze locking once again with Mrs. Fletcher's. Now, Mrs. Fletcher, what's it going to be? Mrs. Fletcher stood stiffly, her face flushed. I think we need to have a conversation about Jamal's educational plan moving forward. Simone's smile was thin. Yes, we do. Mrs. Fletcher's gaze dropped. And perhaps an apology would be appropriate. Simone's brows lifted. Mrs. Fletcher swallowed hard. She turned toward Jamal, her face tight and controlled. Jamal, she said, her voice brittle. I'm sorry if you felt disrespected. Jamal's lips parted. He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward his mother. Simone's expression didn't change. Try again, she said softly. Mrs. Fletcher's jaw tightened. I'm sorry for my words. They were inappropriate. Jamal's chest tightened. He couldn't quite trust it, but his mother's steady presence beside him made it easier to breathe. Simone smiled faintly. That's a start. Mr. Davis cleared his throat. Well, I think we've made some progress here today. Simone's gaze sharpened. Progress would be ensuring that my son, and every student in this school, is treated with respect and dignity moving forward. Mr. Davis nodded quickly. Of course. Simone's eyes lingered on Mrs. Fletcher for a long moment before she placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. We're done here. She turned toward Jamal. Let's go. Jamal stood, his chest still tight, but his steps steady as he followed his mother toward the door. Just before they reached the exit, Simone paused. She turned back toward Mrs. Fletcher, her gaze calm but piercing. One more thing, Simone said. You should know that Jamal wants to be a doctor. Mrs. Fletcher blinked. And I have no doubt, Simone continued, that he's going to get there. Simone smiled faintly. Then she turned and walked out the door, Jamal trailing behind her. As they stepped into the hallway, Jamal glanced up at his mother. Mom? Yes. How did you know? His voice was quiet. Simone smiled down at him. Because I know who you are, even when they don't. Jamal's chest tightened, but this time, it wasn't from shame. It was from something deeper, stronger, pride. The hallway was quiet, except for the soft tap of Simone's heels against the polished floor. Jamal walked beside her, his small hand resting in hers. His head was still swimming from everything that had just happened, but there was something solid beneath the confusion now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. They passed by clusters of students loitering near the lockers. Jamal felt the weight of their eyes, whispers trailing behind them. But for the first time, he didn't shrink under the attention. His mother's words were still echoing in his head. You are smart. You are capable. And no one gets to make you feel small. Jamal. He turned and saw Marcus, one of the boys from his class, hurrying toward him. Marcus slowed when he reached them, his eyes flicking toward Simone uncertainly before landing back on Jamal. Hey. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. I saw what happened back there. Jamal's stomach tightened. Marcus hesitated. That was messed up. What Mrs. Fletcher said. Jamal's heart thumped painfully against his chest. He expected Marcus to laugh, to make some kind of joke at his expense. But Marcus's eyes were serious. His mouth pulled into a thin line. She was wrong, Marcus said quietly. You're probably smarter than all of us. Jamal's breath hitched. He didn't know what to say. Before he could respond, Marcus glanced at Simone and nodded. Your mom's pretty cool. Simone's lips curved into a smile. I know, Marcus grinned. Anyway, see you in class. Jamal nodded. Yeah, see you. Marcus jogged away down the hall. Jamal watched him go, his chest feeling lighter. Simone squeezed his hand. You okay? Jamal hesitated. Yeah, I think so. They continued walking toward the front entrance. The sun was spilling through the glass doors, casting golden light onto the tile floor. As they stepped outside, Jamal felt the warmth of the sun on his skin. He closed his eyes for a second and breathed in the fresh air. Mom. Jamal's eyes opened. Did you mean it? That I could be a doctor? Simone crouched down so she was at eye level with him. Her hands rested gently on his shoulders. Listen to me. Her voice was soft but steady. You are not defined by anyone's expectations. You are not limited by their ignorance or their judgment. You get to decide who you become. And yes, you can be a doctor. Jamal's throat tightened. Simone smiled faintly. And when you are, you'll be the kind of doctor that Mrs. Fletcher will wish she had shown more respect. Jamal laughed, a real, unguarded laugh. Simone stood and brushed his cheek with her thumb. Come on, let's get you something to eat. Jamal grinned. Pizza. Simone sighed playfully. Fine. Pizza. They started toward the car, the tension of the day unraveling with each step. But before they reached the parking lot, Jamal slowed. Mom? She turned. Thanks, he said. Simone's eyes softened. You never have to thank me for protecting you. Jamal nodded. His chest still felt tight, but it was no longer from fear or shame. It was something else now. Something steady. Pride. Inside the school, Mrs. Fletcher stood frozen in the empty classroom. Her hands trembled as she rubbed them together. Mr. Davis stood beside her, his gaze sharp. Simone James, Mrs. Fletcher murmured. She's Simone James. Mr. Davis nodded, slowly. Vice President of the city's medical board. Mrs. Fletcher's face turned pale. I didn't know. Maybe you should have. Mr. Davis's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he walked away. Mrs. Fletcher remained standing in the empty room, the weight of her mistake settling heavily on her chest. That evening, as Jamal lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his mother's words echoing in his mind. You are smart. You are capable. No one gets to make you feel small. Jamal smiled faintly. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of those words settle deep into his bones. Tomorrow, school would still be school. Mrs. Fletcher would still be his teacher. But Jamal knew something had changed. He wasn't afraid anymore. And for the first time in a long time, he believed in himself. The next day at school, Jamal walked down the hallway with his head held a little higher. The weight that usually sat heavy on his chest was gone. Students who had witnessed the scene the day before glanced at him with a quiet sort of respect. Some nodded at him. Others smiled shyly. Even Marcus gave him a small fist bump as they crossed paths near the lockers. And then there was Mrs. Fletcher. Jamal sat down at his desk, heart beating a little faster, as Mrs. Fletcher walked in. She paused at the front of the room, her eyes settling on Jamal for a long moment. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but then it closed again. Instead, she cleared her throat and began the lesson. But Jamal could feel the shift in the air. She didn't make eye contact with him the way she usually did when she was ready to single him out. She didn't sound as sharp when he raised his hand to answer a question. When class ended, Mrs. Fletcher lingered at her desk as the students filed out. Jamal was nearly at the door when he heard her voice. Jamal, he hesitated. Turned around. Mrs. Fletcher's gaze was guarded, but there was something unfamiliar in her eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. She stopped and inhaled sharply. I misjudged you. Jamal blinked. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes dropped to the floor. And I'm sorry. Jamal didn't say anything for a moment. He could feel Marcus's eyes on him from the hallway. Finally, Jamal nodded. Okay. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Mrs. Fletcher spoke again. You're going to do well here, Jamal. I see that now. Jamal paused. Then, without looking back, he said, I know. Outside, Simone was waiting near the school gate. Her arms were crossed, sunglasses perched on her nose. How was it? She asked, as Jamal approached. Jamal shrugged. Okay. Simone raised an eyebrow. Just okay. Jamal smiled faintly. Mrs. Fletcher apologized. Simone's brow lifted in quiet surprise. She said, I'm going to do well here, Jamal added. And what do you think? Simone asked. Jamal's smile widened. I think she's right. Simone's expression softened. She reached out and brushed a curl away from his forehead. You know, she said quietly, it's not enough to have others believe in you. You have to believe in yourself. Jamal met her gaze. I do. Simone smiled. Good. They started down the sidewalk together, the autumn sun spilling golden light onto the pavement. Jamal's hand slipped easily into his mother's, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking alone. Respect isn't about power or status. It's about seeing people for who they are, Jamal learned that his value didn't depend on the judgment of others, and Mrs. Fletcher, she learned that true strength comes from humility and the willingness to change. Sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't taught in classrooms. They're revealed in the quiet moments when we choose to see each other with kindness and respect.